storm we'll be talking about for years. The capital region blanketed under at least a foot of snow at this hour.
This is virtually unprecedented to have the three major roadways in our area shut down. But as you said, this is a virtually unprecedented storm.
It seems like it's the end of the world is coming.
Counties throughout our area have declared local state of emergencies, asking everyone to stay off the roads. Massive blizzard with record high winds pounding our area right now.
I can tell you the wind chill factors have already gotten to my fingers. We're talking pure numbness right now.
Bob, of what can only be described as a massive storm.
Absolutely right, Sal. What a storm.
The 1993 Storm of the Century. You may also know it as the 93 Superstorm, the No-Name Storm, or the Great Blizzard of 93. I'm Paul Cayano, and I'm the Chief Meteorologist at WNYT. Today marks 30 years since one of the strongest storms of the century. It blanketed huge swaths of the country with snow and affected more than 100 million people over a 4-day period from March 12th through the 15th, 1993. The storm of the century also marked a milestone in weather forecasting here in the United States. These very powerful storms can happen at any time, making it extremely important to analyze them to better prepare for future storms. I'm joined by the First Warning Weather Team, Reed Kisselbeck, Christina Talamo, and Rachel Teedy, along with a few special guests to look back and understand the impacts of how these late winter storms affect the region.
Those of you, though, who are brave enough to step outside, this is what you are in for.
The cars were stopping, turning around, and getting stuck.
This is a NewsChannel 13 special presentation. Storm of the Century, 30 years later. Sponsored by Dr. Gerald Benjamin, S&G Roofing, Mohawk Heating, and Bob's Diner.
On our last special, we detailed the October surprise in 1987. At the time, forecasting technology was not advanced enough to predict the conditions. In contrast, the blizzard of 93 was seen as a shining moment for the science of weather forecasting. The superstorm is widely considered to be the first major storm accurately predicted by computer models 5 days in advance. I sat down with Mike Landon, who was the instructional support specialist at Albany in March of 93, to talk about the evolution of forecasting technology.
When I was forecasting in the 80s, long-range forecasting was really a crapshoot, as we used to call it, because you couldn't trust the models. You'd see a storm on the map one day and the next day it would be gone. Then it'd be back again, then it'd be gone. It depended on where the features from the various models are getting the data from, and coming over the Pacific Ocean, there was never much, you can trust that data. Where it's coming over land, you could believe it because there were observations.
Snow began over upstate New York and New England between 6 and 7 a.m. on Saturday, March 13th. Over the next 24 hours, it would dump nearly 40 inches of snow over parts of the capital region, knocking out power and creating a travel nightmare. Rachel Teedy takes us back into the news vault for the sights and sounds of those days.
We dug through the news vault to find our original coverage from that day and the days after, dealing with the mess left behind. We start with former NewsChannel 13 reporter Chris Jansing.
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
The worst conditions any of these drivers has ever seen.
Can't even see where the road is.
The plows we rode in were going over the Northway between exits 5 and 9, and it was buried, even though crews had cleared it just an hour before. We saw a truck that had been abandoned at least half a mile from the nearest exit, the driver nowhere in sight. DOT has a message for would-be travelers.
Stay home. Let us clean it up and then come out when it's all done.
If interstates were bad, secondary roads were even worse. One couple got stuck playing Good Samaritan on the 378 off-ramp. The car they helped got out. They didn't. The 6 miles that I went with the DOT crews took me nearly an hour.
Former Chief Meteorologist Bob Kovacic forecasted for this storm, calling it impressive.
What a storm. Snowfall measurements. The new measurement at the Albany County Airport, 21.5 inches of snow. You can see generally 20 to 25 inches or so on average in the area. We're going to have more bursts of heavy snow tonight.
Power crews are out fighting an uphill battle.
Is this a dangerous situation for your crews?
Yes, it is. Yes, in a lot of cases we'll have live wires down on the ground, and moving through when your visibility is very limited, we might have to shut more lines down.
Some people got impatient when the roads weren't cleared as fast as they'd like. One man even racking up criminal charges. Phil Bailey reports.
Montgomery County is still digging out, but this snowplow driver encountered an angry resident who couldn't wait any longer.
He got out of the car, reached in the back of the car with a shotgun, walked over to me and grabbed onto it and cocked it, and just started, giving me a hard time, demanding that his road be plowed.
Yeah, well, hey, I'm really sorry.
No shots were fired, but it was a little like Falling Down, the film about a man who finds firepower as the answer to his frustrations. In this case, the alleged gunman, 39-year-old Harold Knowlton, was arrested, charged in Florida town court with menacing, and isn't posing for pictures. There was a mountain of snow in Montgomery County, but the blizzard of '93 affected different people different ways. Edith Knowltner was inspired to paint.
Just happened to think of it as a joke, thought people driving by would look and get a kick out of it.
Graffiti may be against the law too, but the evidence will disappear come the first melt. Phil Bailey, News Channel 13 in Montgomery County.
And travel was a mess. Buses were being rescheduled and canceled. Flights were just the same. Family trips were in jeopardy.
Now we're stuck here in an airport for I don't know how long. We're not happy. 5 children, all excited to go to Disney, and we're stuck in an airport at least until, well, we're going to go to a hotel room, but we're stuck here at least until tomorrow, they tell us now.
Others were planning trips for 2 years, only to have the storm get in the way.
So we'll just wait and see what happens. There's the party. It's party time.
And lots of people thought it was indeed party time, loving all that snow. We've got so many news vaults on our News Channel 13 YouTube page. Just head to YouTube, click on News Vault. For now, opening News Vault 13, I'm Rachel Teedy.
When it comes to this storm, the numbers are staggering. Double-digit snowfall totals were measured in 20 states from Alabama to Maine. Record cold temperatures were seen across portions of the southern United States and eastern parts of the country. That includes a low of 21 degrees in Mobile, Alabama, and 31 at Daytona Beach, Florida. Meanwhile, the mercury plummeted below zero farther north, including 4 below in Rochester, New York, and -12 in Burlington, Vermont. In the United States, the storm knocked out power to more than 10 million households. Just about 40% of the country's population experienced the effects of this storm one way or another. Nearly 60,000 lightning strikes were recorded as the storm swept over the country for a total of 72 hours. In all, the storm killed 318 people and caused $5.5 billion in damages, equivalent to $10.8 billion today. This storm is the country's second most costly winter storm to date. A big factor in the strength of this storm was the timing. There was lingering cold air in place, yet an increasing contrast in temperature as more southern locations warmed up, and that led to a powerful jet stream. Christina Talamo walks us through how those factors led to this powerhouse storm.
The setup that led to the 1993 storm of the century began with a strong ridge of high pressure just off the west coast of the United States and a deep trough of cold air expanding from the Rockies all the way across the eastern half of the country. Because of the way that this pattern was set up, the polar jet stream was able to drive all of this cold air from the North Pole on southward into the eastern half of the United States. Now, after all this very cold air was pulled southward, it clashed with very warm air over South Texas and the Gulf of Mexico. This created a strong temperature gradient, which fueled the development of an unusually powerful low-pressure system in the western Gulf of Mexico. This system became our major storm of the century as it rapidly intensified, strengthened to record low pressure levels, and eventually tracked northward up the east coast. So the main reason that the storm was able to intensify into such a major storm was because of that sharp temperature contrast across the country. But why exactly does a strong temperature gradient help a storm intensify? Well, as you know, storms often form along fronts where there is a boundary between warm air and colder air. Now, typically we talk about warmer air being near the equator and colder air being near the poles. And because the atmosphere is always trying to balance itself out, if a very cold air mass is next to a very warm air mass, you will end up with very cold air pushing towards the equator and very warm air pushing towards the poles. Eventually, over time, these air masses moving in opposite directions so close together start to rotate, creating a counterclockwise flow in the atmosphere. This counterclockwise flow then forms an area of low pressure as low pressure systems rotate counterclockwise. Therefore, the stronger the temperature gradient, the stronger the storm could become, and this is what led to the rapid strengthening of the storm of the century in 1993.
And I remember taking a bunch of children through the Weather Center on a tour. And I remember telling them that the computer was forecasting this big snowstorm for us, 1 to 2 feet of snow, but it was going to happen on Saturday. And they wouldn't get any snow days out of it. So the kids were disappointed, but I still said we might have a lot of snow to deal with by the weekend. And then, of course, we hit Wednesday and it's there. And then, of course, on Thursday, the Weather Service actually put up a storm warning, which 48 hours in advance about, that had never happened before. And then, of course, Friday, we were under a blizzard warning. Now, think about that. I remember pumping gas on Friday when it was perfectly clear and sunny, knowing there's a blizzard warning up, thinking that my career is now on the line.
I'm Rachel Teedy, joined now by the First Warning Weather Team and past members, former Chief Bob Kovacic. So excited to have you here. Good to see you. We just saw Christina's piece, and there's so much of this conversation about how this was such an unprecedented storm. So I want to ask you about that here in just a second. But first, let's talk about Christina and Reed and myself. We did not exist when this storm happened.
You kids.
I know, us young people. We did not exist. So what was it like for you to research this storm and put this story together?
Yeah, and honestly, when we were talking about this storm, just an incredibly powerful storm, right? And this is like the storms we would dream about as kids growing up, just having a love for the weather. We love blizzards, love snowstorm, all of that. And just researching this storm, even watching some of the footage, I was just like, wow, I wish I was able to experience something like this. And just looking at some of like the models, of course, we're looking at everything after the fact. We're not actually forecasting in real time, but it's just incredible just to see how incredibly powerful this system was. Again, we talk about how low pressure systems form, what can lead them to intensify in certain ways, but this was no ordinary storm, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And Reed, I mean, same situation, and you're from here, so I'm sure your family has stories of this.
Well, yeah, so the interesting part for me is growing up, every meteorologist can attest to they have their own storm that got them involved and interested in weather. And hearing about this storm from family, I'm like, I'm sure this inspired a lot of people to maybe even look into weather. But the other interesting part for me is sometimes you can be very narrow-minded and just be like, oh yeah, just a big snowstorm for here. So doing the research on this and realizing it wasn't just here, it was all like a third of the whole country, and in different types of weather that we had going on, severe thunderstorms down south to snow up here, made it a lot more interesting and fun for me to look into this one.
Absolutely. So Paul, talk about a little bit why this was so unprecedented.
Well, I think as Reed touched on more than anything, it was the magnitude, the sheer surface area across the country that this thing encompassed. And it started down in the Gulf Coast, and you know, we're going to track the whole thing, but the amount of people, the impacts that it had on the population of the whole country in general was just enormous. Even, you know, the domino effect of travelers and so forth. And if you take things that you've experienced in weather, like a thunderstorm or a severe thunderstorm or a snowstorm or a bad snowstorm, and you multiply that by like 1.5 or 2, that was this storm. It was just above a notch or a notch and a half above any other storms that we've seen.
And we should point out that the globe behind us is the data from that storm, and it shows, I mean, how widespread this was.
Absolutely.
All right.
For meteorologists, it was a Super Bowl of storms, because you just don't encounter something like this at all. With the extent of the storm, area it covered, and the wide range of all kinds of weather over much of the eastern half of the country was just everything you could point to, different kinds of weather. It was one thing I want to point out before I talk about that is, unlike these days or now, this storm was pretty well forecasted 5, 6, 7 days ahead of time. Not so much as X is going to get this amount of snow, but there's going to be a storm on the East Coast, and that was so. And in this day and age, that was pretty good that we were able to do that in 30 years ago.
Absolutely. In your time forecasting, has anything ever come close to the 93 storm?
Blizzard of 1888. Oh, no, I wasn't around then.
Sure you weren't around for that.
The coverage of the storm area that it covered was pretty phenomenal, for sure.
Absolutely.
The storm paralyzed the East Coast, closing airports and highways across the country.
Driving out there is treacherous, in fact, not just in the capital region, but throughout much of New York and the Northeast.
When we come back, we'll take you through the travel nightmare that plagued the capital region and the country for days after the storm. Nowadays, many of us know when snow is coming well in advance, but believe it or not, that wasn't always the case. In fact, this marked one of the first storms where forecasters were confident enough of the computer forecast models to start making decisions even before the snow started to fall.
That was the first time that a storm had ever been forecast 5 days in advance, and that storm warnings were up so far in advance. And for a storm that basically affected the Gulf states and the Caribbean all the way to Eastern Canada, I mean, the scope of this thing was just amazing. And I just remember that being the first big hit for the computer models for that time period.
The storm closed several large airports along the East Coast and smaller airports in dozens of other cities, including here at the Albany International Airport. Let's take a look at the travel nightmare that unfolded across the capital region during the storm.
Potential record-breaking blizzard tonight, closing most major roads, including the New York State Thruway and Northway.
This is virtually unprecedented to have the three major roadways in our area shut down.
Stay home. Let us clean it up and then come out when it's all done.
Drifts are so bad down there. The cars were stopping, turning around, and getting stuck.
The snow has been falling for hours. The roads are covered. The roads are slick. The roads, quite frankly, they are dangerous.
All flights here at the Albany County Airport have been canceled until tomorrow morning. And this weather is making getting around on the ground just as impossible.
Well, we started in Miami. We were on a cruise. Since then, we have been to approximately 3 different airports in 3 days, and we still can't get home.
Greyhound and Trailway bus stations closed tonight. Amtrak says the Chicago-bound train was canceled tonight, and the northbound train from New York City is at least 1 hour late.
Don't go forward. There you go.
I had to drive home in this last night between 8 and 9, and it wasn't fun.
About 30 inches of snow fell in parts of Rensselaer County and disrupted everyone's weekend plans. Tessa Bentulin spoke to a local historian about how the storm impacted Rensselaer County, causing major travel delays, tying up city streets and rural roads.
And the snow was just piling up and piling up. It made for a stressful afternoon for a little bit.
Kathy Sheehan remembers watching her high school daughter put on a pretty dress and do her hair and makeup for her sophomore soiree. But Sheehan was also looking out the window and seeing the inches of snow pile up in the front yard.
She was upstairs getting ready and keep thinking, oh no, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. I was like, oh, honey, I don't think this is going to happen.
Not only is Sheehan a concerned mom wondering when her daughter's school is going to finally cancel the soiree, she's a historian at the Hart Clute Museum in Troy.
The winds were just really howling along. We just kept worrying about trees in the backyard.
Sheehan says Rensselaer County got about 30 inches of snow from the 1993 blizzard. Once her daughter's school canceled the dance, they sat and waited for the storm to pass. Sheehan says the cleanup was a mess for Rensselaer County. She specifically remembers the large amount of snow that piled up on street corners.
When you get to major intersections, you had to cut back that snow because the piles were so large. You couldn't see around the corners. That was some of the things that they were trying to get rid of first, was to knock some of that snow off the corners.
But where do you put all the snow? Sheehan says big piles of snow went to Prospect Park.
In the springtime, that was made for a lot of difficult cleanup. As that all melted, and first off, it took forever for it to melt. Those piles of snow well into April were we're still there.
Travel issues and cleanup was a major effort all across the capital region and beyond. This internal newsletter from the New York State Thruway says a well-forecast storm and good preparations got the Thruway through the blizzard of '93 without major incidents. In what the Thruway considered an unusual move, the Thruway closed from Orange County all the way past Rochester. That's about a 370-mile stretch. The Thruway completely reopened almost 38 hours later. In this 1993 annual report, it also said Thruway dispatchers fielded more than 1,000 calls for assistance that weekend and received more than 40,000 calls on its road conditions number.
We do have some photographs actually from one of our volunteers. Her name is Barbara Urban, and this is from up on the hill in Sickaway. The snow is just piled up across, but there's a little tiny tractor trying to make a path through there.
The equipment shows up, the big road grader and everything to clear the streets.
Barbara Urban still lives in the same home where that photograph was taken 30 years ago, although the view from that day has changed a bit. She says she knew a big March storm was going to find its way to upstate New York.
When this one is predicted, the old timers, we weren't surprised. Of course, it's the weekend before St. Patrick's Day. There's always something going on.
But Sheehan and Urban say there is an upside to all of this.
I think always amazing is that the blizzards always bring out the best in all the neighbors. You know, kids are coming out with shoveling. The RPI students, we had fraternities that were near us, and they were shoveling so many people out. It was great.
But most of the clean out, what was good in those days was there were teenage boys all over the neighborhood, so they were making lots of money, shoveling everybody out.
News Channel 13 was out in the elements bringing critical updates along with stories of neighbors and strangers working together.
You have to come up with creative ways to show people, to try to get them to see just what the situation is.
When we come back, hear from some familiar faces as they share their memories of covering this historic storm. While many people hunkered down during the storm, News Channel 13 crews braved the wind and snow to bring people across the capital region the latest breaking details. We brought back some people who covered the storm to share what they remembered from 30 years ago. Taniqua Penix has that story.
Well, we've had some snow this year, but that's nothing compared to what meteorologists call the storm of the century. And for that, I'm going to toss it back to my favorite decade, the 90s, for the 1993 blizzard.
In the eastern Gulf of Mexico last night, bombed along to the northeast.
Meteorologist Bob Kovacic calls the 1993 storm the Super Bowl of snowstorms, and kickoff was Saturday morning, March 13th, 1993.
A lot of energy available to this storm, and it took it all out and just boom, it dumped it on the East Coast.
And whenever there's a major storm, it's all hands on deck, from the meteorologists, the anchors, and of course the reporters and the photogs braving it out in the elements.
Visibility is expected to be bad throughout the night.
In the hill towns of Rensselaer County, the problem isn't the plows, it's the wind.
It's just not getting any better out here. It's about 18 inches where I am, and I don't know if you can see, but I'm just going to try and step in here. You can see how deep
I think when you have something like that, something where Mother Nature has just pounded an area, you have to come up with creative ways to show people, to try to get them to see just what the situation is.
Randy, all flights here at the Albany County Airport have been canceled until tomorrow.
Lane Houston focused on travel conditions, while Bonita Zahn,
Memorial Hospital is and other hospitals around the capital region. One of the biggest problems they're facing tonight is getting people out of the hospital, patients I mean.
Talked about the challenges hospitals faced.
I enjoyed reporting in the snow because it was so real about how a community responds, comes together. It's a test of the community's mettle.
The blizzard covered a large area from Florida to Maine, inland to the Appalachians.
So what a storm. Snowfall measurements.
One thing I remember that stands out, flashes in my brain, was it was well forecasted days ahead of time by the national computer models.
The capital region saw record-breaking snowfalls, with some areas getting 2 to 3 feet of snow. Dan Levy was reporting for a different television station, but he shares what he remembers about that snowy weekend.
Just imagine
Waking up on a Sunday morning in March and seeing 2 or 3 feet of snow outside, it cripples the area. It was before the day of these backpacks. I mean, we had to get a satellite truck or a microwave truck to some other place in the area, mindful that there were several feet of snow on the ground.
And think about that. You knew where payphones were, and that was it. You had a two-way to talk back to the station.
And I'm the original OG. I always took a notebook. I know that even today, a lot of you young people, you use your phones, and I don't. I go old-fashioned. I got to write it down.
And in a storm like this, there were a lot of notes to jot down.
Right now, very heavy snow, visibility 0, winds. Here's the...
It was just, people were just, whoa, you know, which of course the weather people would go, whoa, too. I mean, these are the long-time employees here that were working here, and they were all aghast, even for long-term hardened reporters, aghast at how this storm took shape and hit us so hard.
People would come out and help someone who needed a hand. Someone would shovel, somebody would clear a car, somebody would help someone across the street. And seeing that really reminded you about the community in which you lived and you reported for.
So looking back, what would you say to your younger self?
I said tell my younger self to get a better hat.
Make sure you had a better hat.
Get a different job.
Of course, they all love what they do and reporting for this community, but for Bob, he says it was one of the highlights of his career.
I look 30 years younger, I know that. And that was a whopper. It really was but you know, then I get excited about interesting weather, so it was one heck of a storm.
The blizzard canceled hundreds of scheduled public events, including...
Well, I hope you enjoyed that walk down memory lane with the people who were first on the scene. Reporting here in Manans, Taniqua Penix, News Channel 13 with coverage you can trust.
We were hand plotting maps and tracking the storm. I mean, this was the way weather was, hands-on. I loved it. And we were, in fact, if you remember, we were doing live updates with WGY radio. I mean, we were on, it seemed like every 15, 20 minutes giving them updates on the storm. And we covered them pretty much all day Saturday. And then I remember leaving in the afternoon when the snow started to get heavy, because it had started around daybreak in the Albany area and got very heavy later in the day. And then you guys, the students, took over in the overnight period into Sunday. And boy, that storm just pounded us, and it was just historic.
So we heard him mention the students in his soundbite there, and you were one of those.
Yeah, 93 was my senior year here at Albany. Exciting. And the reason I remember it so well is because in our synoptic dynamic class, which was the final semester, the biggest class, we had a huge project due on the Monday after this particular weekend. But our professor, Dr. Bozart, he said, you know what? Put everything down. Don't bother with the projects. We want you to study this storm in its entirety from the week before through its conclusion, because you're never going to see anything like this again.
And Bob, what do you remember from that day? I mean, I put together a news vault. We saw it a little bit earlier in this special, and it showed you, at the wall talking about this storm. And what do you remember?
I remember how primitive the graphics look compared to what we have today. But I remember it was just wall to wall, people coming in the building, the reporters, the anchors, and just running around and where to go and where to cover it, and all the video, and it was crazy, but it was controlled craziness as far as the coverage, and it was just, like I said, it was a Super Bowl of storms for us. It was just a classic big storm.
It must have been such a thrill to be in the moment, just forecasting this, going all day long.
I don't think people understand how maybe they're not the right word, as excited we are, but it's part of our job, part of our business, and to see something like this, what Mother Nature can churn out and crank out with all the factors coming into place to create such a monster storm. It just, everything came into place up and down the East Coast, much of the eastern half of the country, that fell in place and was just perfect for creating the perfect storm.
Absolutely. It's like breaking news in the newsroom, that adrenaline, that teamwork, the way it comes together. But this was the breaking news of the weather world.
No question. Now someday Christina and Reed will encounter a storm, and you will encounter a storm that's probably not comparable, but a pretty big storm going forward in your TV careers.
And for Reed and Christina, is this something that you guys learned about in your classes?
Yeah, well, we were just talking about, again, we weren't there to experience this, but yes, this was something that we looked at. We had the post, the map on the wall, that the 1993 storm, the blizzard, 1888, all posted on the wall, just incredible storms. And you'd come in as a freshman, you'd see all of these, and then you'd want to learn more about them. So it wasn't directly part of the class, but it was more of, we saw it up there, and then we do kind of our own research on it.
Right, hung in memoriam, I suppose.
Yeah, so I mean, like, it's not obviously this building, but the old building, we had the bulletin boards with all the data up, and so when you come in as a freshman, you look at it and you're like, oh, okay, cool, big snowstorms, awesome. But as you start to learn more and then you look at the data, you start to understand just how significant those storms were. So to have that data up, especially for an area like this, and have those high record storms out there, it kind of sparks that curiosity a little bit more for students who maybe were thinking about it to look into those things a little bit more.
From the Gulf Coast to Canada, more than 40% of the country felt the effects of this storm.
It was pounding Florida with severe weather. They were getting storm surges as you would from a hurricane. There was something, 50 tornadoes that occurred.
When we come back, we'll track the storm's path of destruction up the East Coast. The enormous storm barreled up the East Coast with blinding snow, driving sleet, and winds that sometimes reached over 100 miles per hour. In addition to 6-foot snow drifts in the south, the storm also spawned tornadoes in several other states. Let's take a look at how the rest of the country was affected.
Alabama doesn't typically see a lot of heavy snow, but from March 12th to 13th, Birmingham received 12 straight hours of snow as temperatures dropped. In some places, 2 to 3 inches came down each hour. All 67 counties in the state got some snow, which is extremely rare. More than 400,000 homes lost power, and the blizzard resulted in more than $50 million in damages.
Heavy wet flakes quickly accumulated in Knoxville, Tennessee, officially recording 15 inches. Life pretty much came to a halt with road crews unable to keep even the main roads clear for long as the snow fell. In the days that followed, high snow drifts lined the roadways, and many people learned for the first time the fun of digging out driveways and sidewalks. Emergency crews worked to help people in need, and even the military was called in to use helicopters to drop off food and supplies to secluded homes.
Roanoke, Virginia picked up an impressive 16 inches of snow. The weight of the snow collapsed roofs, snow drifts were as high as 10 feet, and thousands of people were left stranded on area interstates. The cold air lingered for several days, which allowed the snow piles to linger around for weeks, well into April. The storm even led to a new home of a local sports team. The Lancerlot Sports Arena in Vinton collapsed due to the weight of the record snowfall, forcing the Virginia Lancers of the ECHL to relocate to nearby Roanoke and become the Roanoke Express.
At the White House, President Clinton spent part of the morning discussing the federal government's response to the storm. But no one was getting in or out of Washington, D.C. The storm closed National and Dulles International airports, shut down the Smithsonian Institution, and much of the downtown commercial district. It left the nation's capital eerily quiet. Schools were shut down for 4 days.
And in the tri-state area, heavy seas washed ashore along coastal areas of New Jersey, Long Island, and Connecticut. In New York City, the snow began several hours before dawn. By afternoon, 1,272 snowplows and 350 salt spreaders were moving through the streets. At one point, wind gusts reached 71 miles per hour at LaGuardia Airport. The Red Cross set up evacuation centers at public schools in Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx.
When you think of March, you might think spring, but the weather doesn't always cooperate. Some of the most powerful snowstorms in the capital region in recent memory have occurred over the same 4-day stretch in the month of March. When we come back, Reed Kisselback will tell us why that is. For many of us, March brings thoughts of spring. Spring training is in full swing. The kids are nearing spring break. Minutes of daylight are added each day, and the coldest time of year is usually in the rearview mirror. Despite all of that, March snowstorms could be record-setting. Reed Kisselback explains why.
Let's review other major March storms. The month of March has historically been the most extreme month of the year weather-wise. Why?
March is the transition month from winter to spring, when northern snowpacks are often peaking while sunlight is increasingly strong and there's increasing daylight, warming the air more efficiently. The battle between winter's Arctic air and spring's subtropical air and a still active March jet stream can result in extreme weather. Knowing this, it should come as no surprise that if we look at the top 20 greatest snowstorms for Albany on record, that 4 of those snowstorms happened in March, including the top 2. Those 2 are the blizzard of 1888 and the superstorm of 1993. In fact, some of the more notable major winter storms occurred around March 11 to 15th. Let's take a look. The blizzard of 1888. This is known as the blizzard by which all others are measured and is still the record for the city of Albany to this day. After 60 hours, a total snowfall of 46.7 inches was reported, but the drifts were significantly higher. This storm still holds the record snowfall for a storm for Albany. The city of Albany was virtually shut down. There were no coal deliveries and thus no heat. Doctors were unable to make house calls, and it took many days to clear the snow off of country roads to make them passable. At the time, it was called the worst storm in living memory, and it still holds the distinction of the worst winter storm on record in many areas of the Northeast. March 14, 2017 nor'easter, otherwise known as the Pi Day blizzard. A very significant coastal snowstorm impacted the region March 14th, featuring extremely heavy snowfall and blizzard conditions. This snowstorm was regarded as the largest snowstorm to impact the area since the Valentine's Day 2007 snowstorm. Snowfall reports range mainly from 1 to 3 feet, with some portions of the area picking up nearly 4 feet of snowfall. The snow fell at 1 to 4 inches per hour for much of the day. At the Albany International Airport, 17 inches of snow accumulated, making it one of the greatest March snowstorms on record and set a new daily record snowfall for the date. There was extreme widespread public impact, with many roads severely impacted and schools closed for 2 days. A state of emergency was issued for all of New York counties, and tractor-trailers were banned on most area interstates. Numerous counties issued travel bans on county roads. Travel restrictions were issued for the Massachusetts Turnpike. Much of the train service across the region was canceled, and all flights were grounded at Albany International Airport. In addition to the snowfall, gusty winds up to 40 to 50 miles per hour resulted in near-zero visibility and blizzard conditions across the Mid-Hudson Valley, Catskills, Capital District, Conics, Lake George Saratoga region, Berkshires, Litchfield Hills, and much of southern Vermont. At higher elevations across the Berkshires, winds gusted as high as 74 miles per hour. The winds brought considerable blowing and drifting of snow. March 13 to 15, 2018 nor'easter. Shortly after midnight on Tuesday, March 13th, a rapidly developing area of low pressure was off the mid-Atlantic coast. 3-day totals across upslope areas were significant across western New England, with up to 48 inches locally in Woodford, Vermont. Snowfall totals were more variable elsewhere, with around a foot in portions of the Capital District, Catskills, Schoharie Valley, southern Adirondacks, and northwest Connecticut. The Berkshires generally saw 12 to 18 inches, while the Lake George Saratoga region and Mid-Hudson Valley saw only a few inches. This was the third heavy snowfall event in the first half of March 2018. Albany recorded around a foot of snow in each of the events, bringing their March total to 36 inches through the 15th and making 2018 one of the snowiest Marches on record. This storm was not only remarkable for its snowfall and financial impact, but also for marking how far weather technology has come. We'll take a closer look when we return. By March 8th, several numerical weather prediction models recognized the threat of a significant snowstorm. This marked one of the first times National Weather Service meteorologists were able to confidently predict a system's severity 5 days in advance.
I used to tell people that if you hear, say you have a picnic plan for Saturday and on Monday or Tuesday you hear it's supposed to rain, then the next day it's supposed to be sunny, then my point was to throw everything out and start over again, because the models are obviously, something's wrong. But these days, I don't see that happening as much. The modeling has become so amazing that, you can get weekend forecasts now earlier in the week and believe that it might actually happen. Something that back in the early 90s really didn't have that accuracy at even the 3 to 5 day range was a tough call.
So with the models changing, so much, technology has changed so much since then. Talk about what you've seen and how that changed throughout your career.
I'm just trying to remember the models we were using then, which were pretty primitive, but they grabbed a handle on it somewhat at what was coming our way, but just different models then as opposed to now. Now we have choice of so many models to look at that it can be over the top of confusing. But it was just quite an experience to go through this and look out the window and see what was going on. The models did relatively well. Now they were more short, they weren't stretched out as much, they weren't as detailed. The grid spacing on the models was different then than now, so it made pinning down certain aspects of the storm where it would track was the whole ball game. We didn't have any rain out of that. It was all snow here. It was the track of the storm was, if you could write a textbook on storm track, this was it. The storm track was perfect for a big snowstorm.
As you have seen the models grow and change, and what has that been like to see their evolution, how far they've come?
Well, it's kind of a double-edged sword for me because it seemed like it was simpler back then because you only had, you can count the number of models on one hand. So you had a certain amount, a finite amount to look at. Now, it's like the models and their resolution is so incredible because of computer power. So you can look at the details of every model, and now almost every university who has meteorology has their own model. Every agency has their own model. Every National Weather Service in different countries has their own model. And some are excellent models, and you don't want to ignore those models, but you don't have enough time to look at every one.
Yeah, and it can also be like super important to really trust your gut sometimes, because when you have all of this information, it can be pulling you in all these different directions. You could spend all day. We'd never make it on time to our morning show if I was looking at all the models that I wanted to every morning. So a lot of it is trusting yourself, taking bits and pieces of different models. Maybe one model might be picking up a certain aspect of the storm in a certain way, and you look for different things like that. So it's almost like you have so much information that can kind of hurt you, but it's also awesome that you have this available to you that you can check it out.
Our own interaction with the forecast, and it's still the human interaction. You can't look at the models and just put it to bed and go and run with it. You got to use this up here, what we learned in meteorology, and what looks reasonable, what doesn't look reasonable. So there's still a lot, thank heavens, there's a lot of this, the human brain power and knowledge and education that comes into play for reaching the final product.
Right. Well, Bob, you were talking about the topography earlier and how much of a challenge that can be. So elaborate a little bit more on how you had to take that into account, especially for 1993, but just in general.
For any storm, especially snowstorms, but this area is so diverse as far as topography and elevation. So a few miles one way or the other can make a huge difference. Like Grafton will get so much snow, and Poston Kill and whatever, as opposed to Troy and Averill Park. So that's a huge challenge, is break down what you think with our own knowledge of meteorology, what will happen. But again, that's probably one of the bigger challenges for forecasting around here.
Yeah, it's the frustrating part of the forecast sometimes, because we're looking at it and we're going, this has a chance to either be as high as this, but then if we get something like downsloping, those snowfall totals just drop. And so that makes the forecast incredibly challenging. But I think each of us probably attested that's one of the reasons why we like to forecast in this area, because we like the challenge and we want to get it right, and we're going to do our best to get it right.
For sure. Do you have a favorite topography-related phenomenon that happens with forecasting weather?
Well, a lot when we're talking about storms, and especially with winter storms, and how they're so elevation dependent. We talk about this all the time, how just a few hundred feet going up in elevation can make all the difference. Yes, we have a large area, but we're drawing these fine lines between a 2 to 4 inch or a 4 to 8 inch, and it's just one line separating an area that could get close to a foot sometimes, or could get a couple of inches.
All the models in the world are not going to be able to pin down the differences between Albany and the hill towns east or west and Schoharie. So it's just you're playing by past behavior of storms and what they produce across the area. And you talk about the amount of snow, people say, hey, I only got 2 inches here. Hey, you said 12 inches. We like to be right. And we do the best job. I mean, not to, pat us on the back, but snow forecasting is probably the toughest forecast we have around here, for sure.
What are your takeaways from this whole experience?
I'll jump right in and say, I was watching Bob's weather coverage earlier today, and I'm just sitting there, and Bob was talking before about how, this is a Super Bowl of storms, and I'm sure the excitement and the craziness that was going on in the newsroom that day, it was almost like I was feeling it. And we haven't really had a crazy storm in our time when we've really been able to forecast that and be in the NewsChannel 13 studio to experience that.
We do get excited about storms. I know that sounds, people say, why are you so, it's part of our business, it's in our blood that's our Super Bowl. And storms get us excited about what's coming, and to experience a significant storm is up the list as far as all are concerned.
Getting to go back and watch somebody like Bob go out and do a forecast as amazing as he did, knowing too now the technology that he had was astounding and is a testament, sir, to your knowledge. So kudos to you. And it's inspiring, and it makes you want to kind of approach your next storm with a mindset of like, I want to be as good as that.
For those who doubt our ability, I mean, there's always going to be errors, but our errors are so small now in the short term, 1 to 2 days compared. So over the span of 30 years, what you got in a 3-day forecast 30 years ago, now you can get in a 5 to 7 day forecast now, and that's how much more accurate we've become over time.
It'll be really fun to see how things get better as the years go on.
Absolutely.
We asked you to send us your photos of the storm, and you delivered. Check these out. Kim Roberson sent us this picture of her and her sister Allison playing in the snow in North Greenbush. And here's Lindsay Greismer, who's not quite as tall as the snowbanks behind her. Brad Fisher took this photo just before his 11th birthday. He remembered his dad's Jeep struggling to move through the snow. To see more of these photos and to hear more topics we covered during our roundtable, just head to our website. 3 decades later, the storm of the century still ranks among the most impactful, costly, and deadliest weather events of the 20th century. We hope that you've learned about how advancements in weather technology has changed the game when it comes to forecasting and what it was like on that day 30 years ago. Our team is so grateful to have shared this special with you all. Thank you for staying with us through this hour, and if you've missed anything or want to watch it again, head to our website, WNYT.com. Have a good night.